The most painful part wasn't that they forgot his name, it was how easily they kept smiling after. By the time the applause faded through the donor hall, Elliot Ray already knew he would never save that family again. On stage, beneath the white lights and polished gratitude of the Whitlock Health Foundation's newest donor wing opening, Thomas Whitlock stood with a champagne glass in one hand and the kind of confidence that only survives in people who have spent too many years being admired. He thanked the surgeons, the trustees, the lead donors, his wife, his daughter. He did not thank Elliot, not the man who had spent 7 years quietly protecting the foundation from collapse, not the man who had rebuilt the structure beneath it when everything almost came apart, not the man standing only a few feet away, just outside the center line of the cameras, listening as the room applauded a version of history that no longer included him. And the worst part? Audrey said nothing. She didn't interrupt, didn't turn toward him, didn't offer the kind of simple correction people make when someone important has been left out. She just sat there in her ivory silk gown, hands folded, perfectly still, as if silence might make the omission feel less deliberate. It didn't. That was the moment Elliot finally understood something he had been trying not to name for far too long. Some people do not betray you by attacking you. They betray you by learning how to live comfortably with your absence. By tomorrow morning, Thomas Whitlock would no longer control the institution carrying his name. And Audrey would finally understand that Elliot had not gone quiet because he had less to say. He had gone quiet because he was done asking to be heard in rooms that had already made peace with losing him. But before I tell you how a man spent years quietly holding a family legacy together, only to realize he had slowly been erased from the meaning of it, welcome to Luke's Hidden Stories, where the quiet truths behind love, family, betrayal, and power are never as simple as they seem. If stories like this stay with you, make sure to subscribe and stay with me until the end. Because this one isn't just about control. It's about the quieter ways people lose each other long before anyone says goodbye. 5 weeks earlier, Elliot Ray still looked exactly like the kind of man the Whitlocks believed they understood. 38, composed, measured, well-dressed without ever seeming like he was trying to prove anything. The kind of person who listened all the way through before answering, who never reached for the center of the room unless there was a real reason to stand there. In a different family, that might have read as confidence. In the Whitlock family, it read as something easier. Thomas used to call him steady. What he meant was manageable. Thomas Whitlock had built an empire around medicine, philanthropy, and public generosity. His name stood on hospital wings, research grants, and gala invitations. He had spent so many years being called visionary that he no longer seemed to understand the difference between leadership and possession. To him, institutions were extensions of character. Success proved worth. Control proved wisdom. And anyone who did not naturally perform power the way he did could be dismissed as useful but secondary. His wife, Helena, had mastered a colder art. Where Thomas imposed, Helena curated. She never needed volume. She could reduce a person's standing with a pause, a glance, a sentence so polished it almost sounded kind. And then there was Audrey. When Elliot first met her, she had seemed like the one person in that family who still felt reachable. She was elegant, yes. Whitlock-level poised, yes. But there had been softness in her then, a kind of fatigue with performance. She liked that Elliot felt steady, said he made life quieter, said he was the first person she had ever met who didn't seem to need a room to admire him before he could relax inside it. He believed her. Maybe that was true once. Maybe that was what made everything afterward feel less like a sudden betrayal and more like watching warmth leave a room 1 degree at a time. Because relationships like theirs rarely collapse in one clean moment. They thin out. A joke goes unanswered. An apology gets shorter. A silence lasts just a little too long. Someone begins choosing calm over honesty often enough that eventually calm becomes another name for distance. At first, the Whitlocks' disrespect was subtle enough to survive explanation. Thomas liked asking Elliot questions in front of physicians, trustees, and donors, then speaking over him halfway through the answer as if thought only became important once it passed through a louder mouth. Helena liked phrases that looked harmless from a distance. "Elliot has been good for Audrey," she once said over wine at a private dinner. Not every man is made to lead. Some are simply made to steady what matters. People laughed. At first, Audrey used to reach under the table and touch Elliot's hand when that happened. A quiet apology. A private acknowledgement. A small signal that she still recognized the difference between elegance and cruelty. Then she stopped doing that. That was one of the first losses, not the humiliation itself, the disappearance of the instinct to soften it. Over time, Thomas grew bolder in the ordinary ways that often hurt most. He introduced Elliot as Audrey's husband in rooms where everyone else got full names and titles. He smiled when people mistook Elliot for an advisor instead of a partner. He made comments about temperament, scale, risk, and real leadership whenever Elliot raised concerns he didn't want to hear. Once, during a dinner with 2 hospital trustees and a major donor family, Elliot quietly pointed out a governance issue buried inside one of Thomas's expansion structures. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't abstract. It was real, solvable, and important. Thomas swirled his drink, smiled, and said, "Elliot's greatest strength has always been caution. It's admirable in domestic life, less useful when actual scale is involved." The room laughed. Audrey did not laugh loudly. That somehow made it worse. She smiled once, briefly, almost reflexively, then looked down at her plate. Later that night, when Elliot told her how deeply that hurt, she looked tired rather than surprised. "You know how my father is," she said. Elliot stood by the window, staring out at the city. "That's exactly the problem," he said. She crossed her arms. "Not every silence is disrespect." He turned then, not angry yet, but still trying. "What would count as disrespect to you?" Audrey didn't answer that question directly. She said he was reading too much into things. She said he made everything heavier than it needed to be. She said family culture was complicated. She said peace mattered too. That word stayed with him. Peace. Because peace, when it keeps asking the same person to absorb every injury without reply, stops being peace. It becomes imbalance dressed as maturity. And that was the thing the Whitlocks never understood about Elliot. He was not quiet because he lacked language. He had tried language. He had pushed back. He had told the truth. He had defended himself. He had tried to explain, more than once, that what wounded him wasn't simply Thomas's arrogance or Helena's polish. It was Audrey's growing willingness to let it pass through the room unanswered. He did not need her to perform loyalty. He did not need her to fight every battle for him. He only needed to know that if he was slowly being diminished in front of her, she still understood it mattered. But every attempt to say that aloud somehow came back to him sounding difficult, too sensitive, too intense, too determined to make things mean more than they did. So he learned what many people in quietly failing relationships eventually learn. Sometimes the most exhausting part of pain is not the pain itself. It's being asked over and over to treat it like an overreaction. What the family never fully grasped was how much of Whitlock Health Foundation was standing because of Elliot's invisible work. 7 years earlier, during a convergence of donor instability, internal controls failure, and executive overreach that nearly shattered the institution's credibility, it was Elliot who stepped in quietly and kept everything from collapsing. Not as a public hero, not as a titled executive, not for recognition, for Audrey. Back then, she had come to him frightened, stripped of her polish, and asked for help in a voice that still carried trust without calculation. So Elliot helped. He rebuilt the recovery structure, redesigned the donor protection pathways, repaired the governance architecture, paired the contingency framework that allowed the institution to survive without ever admitting how close it had come to public disgrace. Thomas signed what needed signing because he had no better option. He barely read most of it. That, too, mattered. Because buried inside those documents, under emergency protections, fiduciary clauses, oversight contingencies, and donor continuity language, sat the one thing Thomas had never respected enough to remember: a dormant control mechanism, conditional, silent, legally binding, activated only under clear thresholds of executive misconduct, governance abuse, or material institutional risk. Elliot held it. He never wanted to use it. He had not married Audrey with contingency in mind. He had not built his life with her as if preparing for war. He had loved her honestly. And people who love honestly rarely imagine how much damage can be done by what goes uncorrected. The moment everything shifted did not come during a public humiliation. It came in the archive room 2 nights before the donor wing opening. Elliot had gone to retrieve a continuity binder Thomas wanted referenced in the gala materials. The room was cold and quiet, lined with ledgers, framed benefactor portraits, old filing boxes, and decades of institutional memory. That was where he heard Audrey's voice. She was in the adjoining office with Helena, speaking softly enough that the words felt almost intimate. "I'm not trying to hurt him," Audrey said. Helena answered in that measured tone of hers. "Then don't call it hurt. Call it the future." There was a pause. Then Audrey said the sentence Elliot would replay later more than any of Thomas's insults. "I just don't think he fits the future of this family anymore." She didn't say it with cruelty. She didn't say it with contempt. She said it with sadness. And that was what made it devastating. Because there are moments in life when someone does not reject you violently. They simply begin arranging a future in which your absence feels more convenient than your presence. Helena said something about restructuring, foundations, public roles, and emotional complications. Audrey answered quietly, "He's not a bad man. That's what makes this harder." Elliot stood perfectly still. That line broke something in him, but not in the way dramatic stories usually imagine breakage. He didn't feel rage first. He felt clarity. Because if she had been cruel, he might still have argued with her. If she had been cold, he might still have hoped to warm her. If she had blamed him loudly, there might still have been enough heat left between them to suggest the relationship was alive enough to fight for. But this was someone speaking about him as if he had already become a problem that kindness should know how to remove cleanly. That night, Elliot did not confront her. He did not ask for one more conversation from someone who had already begun translating love into logistics. He went back to his office, and for the first time in years, he stopped trying to save the marriage before saving himself. What followed was not revenge. It was clarity arranged into action. He reopened the recovery files, pulled the dormant trustee language, reviewed donor protection thresholds, mapping the violations already crossed by Thomas's newest expansion. recovered internal correspondence showing pressure where there should have been oversight, spoke privately with trustees who still remembered the crisis years and knew what Elliot had once carried without ever attaching his name to the work, prepared the governance packet, triggered the review language, reactivated the control mechanism, and slowly assembled the framework through which truth could enter the room without ever again asking permission to stay there. This is what powerful families miss most often. Silence is not emptiness. Sometimes it is the sound of consequence being built carefully enough that no one notices until the doors stop opening. The donor wing opening came and went. The speech, the applause, the omission. Elliot stood through all of it, and when the cameras cut away, he did not go looking for Audrey. There was no scene in a corridor, no last-minute plea, no confrontation large enough to justify the ache he was carrying. He went home, opened the final packet, slept for a few hours, and arrived at Whitlock Health Foundation before anyone else. The private governance meeting began at 9. Not a glittering boardroom spectacle, not an event designed for public destruction. Just a long room overlooking the river, where people who truly controlled the future of institutions met when polished language stopped being useful. Thomas walked in first, carrying the confidence of a man who believed habit and authority were basically the same thing. Helena followed. Audrey took her seat along the side. The trustees settled into the room with the cautious stillness of people who already sensed something had changed but did not yet know its shape. Thomas moved through the agenda efficiently. Expansion, donor realignment, naming rights, long-term strategic continuity. Then he came to the restructuring item he believed would pass cleanly. "If there are no concerns," he said, "we'll move to approval." Elliot opened the folder in front of him. No drama, no raised voice, no theatrics. "I have one concern," he said. Thomas looked up, irritated rather than alarmed. "And what concern is that?" Elliot slid the first packet across the table, then the second, then the activation memorandum. A trustee went still halfway through the second page. Another removed his glasses. Thomas frowned. What exactly is this supposed to be? Elliot met his eyes. The part everyone treated like history. Silence settled into the room. Not the social kind, the structural kind. The kind that arrives when people understand all at once that the center of gravity has moved. Elliot kept his voice even. 7 years ago, under the emergency recovery framework executed to preserve this institution, a contingent authority mechanism was established under donor protection and fiduciary breach conditions. Those conditions have now been met. He tapped the last page. Effective this morning, control over restructuring authority no longer sits with you. Thomas stared at him. That's impossible. No, Elliot said. It's overdue. Then he laid it out page by page. This restructuring is suspended. This donor wing review is being reopened. Expansion authority is frozen pending trustee evaluation. Your role remains ceremonial while compliance and governance review proceed. Thomas let out a short, disbelieving breath. You think you can do this to me? Elliot didn't flinch. I think you spent too many years mistaking gratitude for permission. The room stopped breathing. For a man like Thomas, the real humiliation was not being shouted down. It was being answered cleanly. He looked around the table for loyalty. What he found instead was process. Trustees reading, counsel marking pages, people adjusting internally to a future that no longer required his approval. Then Elliot turned toward Audrey. He did not speak to wound her. That would have been easier and much smaller. He spoke because there was no point pretending the deepest loss in the room belonged to governance. I spent a long time thinking patience would help this family hear me, he said. In the end, it only taught me which silences were empty and which ones were telling the truth. Audrey looked down. For the first time in a very long time, there was nothing graceful left for her to say. No phrasing, no smoothing, no practical explanation that could turn what had happened into something gentler than it was. Elliot gathered the remaining documents. Before he left, he placed one final page at the center of the table and said the only line anyone there would still remember years later. "You didn't lose control today," he said quietly. "You lost it slowly. Every time you mistook quiet loyalty for permanent permission." Then he walked out. By evening, Thomas Whitlock still had his name on the building. But names are not the same thing as authority. The expansion was frozen. The review had begun. The donor wing already meant something different than it had the night before. And the foundation that once reflected Thomas's certainty now answered to structures he had spent too many years ignoring. But what stayed with people afterward was not only Thomas's loss, it was Audrey. Because the story did not end for her in that room. It continued afterward, in memory. The omitted name, the unchallenged laughter, the many times Elliot had spoken before finally deciding silence was no longer patience. It was proof. That is what makes endings like this linger. Not the elegance of the reversal, not the legal architecture, not even the satisfaction of seeing arrogance lose. What lingers is the more human question underneath all of it. How many relationships begin to disappear in the moments no one interrupts? How many people feel themselves growing alone while still technically loved? How often does tenderness survive in words long after it has stopped being practiced? Elliot walked away with control. Thomas lost the institution he thought answered to his will, but Audrey was left with the hardest thing to carry. Not scandal, not shame, not punishment, but the private knowledge that the ending had not begun in one dramatic betrayal. It had begun much earlier, in smaller silences, in polished rooms, in all the moments she chose not to reach across the distance while it was still small enough to cross. Maybe that is why stories like this stay with people. Not because the quiet man finally became undeniable, but because hidden inside that moment is a sadness many people recognize too late. That some of the deepest endings do not begin with cruelty. They begin with one person speaking, then explaining, then asking, then waiting, until one day they stop. And by then, the silence is no longer a question. It is the answer. If this story stayed with you,